Thank you. It's kind. It's nice to be here. I'm going to try and sort of take up what we might call a post-liberal position, and I'll explain what I mean by that. If only partly so we can have a proper disagreement and discussion and debate. So I might push on some areas for reasons of provocation. Why not? Which I think is an essential feature of dialogue and debate. Especially in a world in which people have become often very afraid to say even what they actually think. So on the question of progress, I wanted to begin with a quote from Ulrich Beck, who you've probably come across. He's the author of a famous book called The Risk Society from 1992, which is a sort of delightful read in its kind of boringness, and I mean that in the nicest possible ways. But he has a very interesting comment on industrial society, and obviously we had the mention of Ted Kaczynski. I see Ted Kaczynski, obviously his methods were hugely deplorable, but his work is very much along the lines of a kind of Frankfurt School critique of technology, a kind of horror at modernity. And at one point he says, you know, we have to rip the plaster off, right? We can't do this slowly. Ulrich Beck, I think, has a clever way of trying to understand what happens in modernity. He's talking about what he describes as an inescapable structural condition of advanced industrialization. He describes it in the following way. He says, modern society has become a risk society in the sense that it is increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risks that it itself has produced. Okay, so this is, you know, easy to understand in a certain way, but actually very, very profound. It relates also to what Marx was diagnosing in the middle of the 19th century in terms of the inevitable consequences and costs, if you like, in part of what it meant to industrialize. On the one hand, you have the dissolution of old social bonds, the destruction of religion, a certain kind of emancipation of a certain image of the individual, and I'll come back to the individual in a bit. And on the other, you have the loss of those things, you know. And I think that the important thing to bear in mind whenever we're talking about progress in terms of costs and benefits, we always have to bear in mind both constantly. Like whatever gain we think we're getting, it will also come at a price, whether it's something to do with development in medicine, whether it's something to do with the development in technology or energy, and so on. And I think sometimes there's a kind of fantasy, an ideological fantasy, that we can have all of the advantages of technology with no implications and no costs, as if we can live in a pure, smooth space of freedom from suffering. And this isn't true. And I want to say that suffering is a necessary feature of human existence. It's what religion has always understood, and the destruction of religion has also come at the cost of an understanding of suffering. And I'm not talking about unnecessary suffering. We want to mitigate unnecessary suffering. We don't want to increase suffering, but we do, I think, want to acknowledge that suffering will never leave us. It is part of the structure and meaning of what it means to be human, that we will suffer things like grief, for example. I'm very, very opposed to the idea, for example, that we should automatically medicalize forms of human suffering that are natural and normal. Okay, and one of the wars that industrial society has waged is, of course, on the very idea of what nature is, including our human nature. So whenever we're thinking about the history of revolutions, and the French Revolution was mentioned in the kind of abstract for this discussion, we have a kind of speeding up on one level of certain tendencies, right? So the Enlightenment ideas of kind of reason, of progress, of eradicating superstition, of fraternity, égalité, liberté, all speeded up like massively in the French Revolution. We live in the aftermath of that revolution. At the time, you have figures like Edmund Burke, well, Edmund Burke in particular, who is often described as the father of conservatism. And he writes a book in 1790, you can see what's happening in France, and he is very anxious that the revolution doesn't spread. And revolutions have a tendency to spread. And they do an awful lot of damage, potentially, right? We might be all for the ideas of the revolution. For example, someone like Immanuel Kant, who we don't necessarily regard as a revolutionary, was nevertheless, if you like, enthusiastic about the outcome of the French Revolution, if not the method and the means by which they got there. Edmund Burke proposes that conservatism as a practice is something like a slowing down of progress. And he suggests that basically whenever there is a proposal to make a change or a shift in political life, in social life, that these questions should be raised and debated and discussed and very, very slowly come to terms with. Whenever groups of people or individuals try to force change very, very, very quickly, there is often usually a backlash. In the case of the French Revolution, we saw, as Edmund Burke predicted, that it descended into the terror, which is basically like a kind of purity spiral where the revolutionaries start attacking other revolutionaries for not being pure enough, and they all end up on the guillotine, right? So this is one of the risks of a very, very, very quick social change. And I think we can see that this kind of political tendency, this urgency, has not disappeared in the modern world. We have lots of political groups. For example, there's a battle going on at the moment, which I find quite amusing, between Pride, which is, we're in Pride Month, and the Pride March in London is on tomorrow, I think, on Saturday, and Just Stop Oil, the environmental movement. So Just Stop Oil have said to Pride, they've kind of issued a series of demands around their use of energy and Pride. And so, but you can see in this somewhat amusing, huh? Well, exactly. So Just Stop Oil have big, exactly, like the kind of pure revolutionaries in the sense that they're more committed to their project to the extent that they're proposing like a rift and a potential war between another progressive movement, i.e. Pride. Pride is, of course, extremely corporate. It's going to be very difficult for them to disavow their dependency on oil and energy companies because they're all supported by banks and so on. Anyway, the point about this example is to highlight that even in an apparently secular, rational age, that these kind of very extreme forms of revolutionary terror, quote unquote, don't leave us. In fact, they remain, which rather presents us with the idea that one thing we need to understand and not get away from is human nature at a deep kind of anthropological level. I've stressed already the ineradicability of suffering, and I think we need to think about this also in terms of medicine. You know, we also live in a world in which people are prescribed antidepressants in their millions. Mary Harrington, who's a very interesting contemporary thinker, someone I'm friends with, defines herself as a reactionary feminist, which is a seeming contradiction in terms, but her entire project, which I recommend, is about precisely confronting something that's supposed to be progressive, i.e. feminism, alongside a critique of progress. And she suggests that the pill, the contraceptive pill, which she opposes, is actually the first transhumanist technology, as she calls it, because it is precisely a form of hormonal control and a form of medication that doesn't depend upon the body being unhealthy. On the contrary, it is a drug taken by women who are otherwise healthy. And when we start to think about the body in terms of taking drugs or having surgeries that are, strictly speaking, unnecessary from the health point of view, then we're in an entire new world of thinking beyond the human. Okay, and we also live in that world, as we know. And it's very obvious, I think, that many people would like there to be serious constraints on the development of some of these technologies because we are bringing new horrors down the pipeline, and I think we have enough of those already to deal with. So there is a kind of a stress here on a kind of slowing down and a conservatism. Of course, that then leaves you open to charges of being a reactionary. Nobody wants to be on the side of the past. And I wonder if part of a political project, is to do with bringing together people from what I would call the old left, which I would regard myself as being a member of, and people on the conservative right, whether religious or otherwise, together. And this is what I want to say about post-liberalism. Post-liberalism is an increasing, I would say, term that's used for a diagnosis of the current situation that we find ourselves in, vis-a-vis liberalism as a 300-year-old political project, an economic project, a social project, and a political project. What does liberalism champion? Liberalism champions free markets. It champions the individual. We're asking, in every case, the individual to reinvent the moral wheel. We've basically destroyed various structures of religious and community understanding. We've destroyed various forms of morality. We're asking every individual to come up with their own moral system. That's quite a burden. I think this is also why we see the recreation of various religious forms in the form of identity politics, tribal belonging, a desperate need to be part of a community. And as annoying as identity politics is, and especially because institutions have been completely captured by this bullshit, at the same time, I think a sympathetic understanding would see it as a form of almost like a religious need to belong, to have a name, a meaning, an identity, and so on, in the wake of the erosion and destruction of pre-existing moral forms. I happen to think that Christianity had a better model of the human being insofar as it understood that we are all equal before God and that we are all broken. I think what we see at the moment with the supposed woke politics is a Christian heresy, which is a kind of Manichaeanism which sees the world in terms of good and bad, which is very dangerous and very simplistic because it creates a world of friends and enemies. And if you're a bad person, and I would know, having been cancelled many, many times, it does mean that people feel almost obliged to attack you, to call you names and to physically assault you and so on. So, this is not a Christian model, right? It's a model that doesn't really promote forgiveness, for example. It creates a kind of fanaticism. And again, these are deep human tendencies that it's very, very hard to get rid of. And I think a better understanding would be to embrace and understand those tendencies. We're still the same kind of people that we always have been. Human beings are not going to change that much. And this is one very serious reason, I think, why we should be very cautious whenever somebody presents something as being progressive or progress, whether it's a medical development, whether it's some sort of, new idea about how we should be governed, whether we should be using various technologies and so on. I think there needs to be this profound caution. As Patrick Deneen, who's a very interesting contemporary thinker, a post-liberal thinker, suggests, he says that liberalism has failed because it has succeeded. Right? This is a very, very interesting claim. That what we've ended up with is a kind of hyper-individualism, a total market society at the expense of all of these things that actually gave us value, whether it be religion, tradition, the family, and so on. And when we have ultra-leftists proclaiming they're in favour of the abolition of the family, you really want to say to them, the family has already been destroyed by the economy, by technology, by the incursion of money into every area of life. And actually what we should be doing is preserving those forms, as best we can against the invasion of these things. Because as Ulrich Becker said, what we're doing is just developing and creating more and more problems for ourselves to solve. And we're saying, we're sort of kicking it down the road and saying, well, we can get some new techs and surely some new technology will turn up at some point and solve this problem. No. This is just kicking everything down the road constantly. And no governments really want to stand up and say, well, actually, let's have a look at the whole thing, rather than just work on getting elected in the next election. So that's a few thoughts. Simply, where does it end? This great sort of English common sense secularism I'm very in favour of. I used to hate this sort of British empiricist common sense thing, but now I love it, and I think the British were right. So whenever your mum says something like, oh, come off it, and don't be silly, I think this is the attitude we should have.
All right, before I begin, I turned 40 last year. I know, unbelievable, what can I say? But I made one promise to myself that once I reach 40, I'm no longer going to hold back, so I can metaphorically undress in front of you, so I make no qualms about what I really think, so I'm going to go forward and tell you what I really think. None of this is going to be recorded, right? So just want to make sure here. So I actually agree with a lot of the things that Nina said, and I think she's onto something that I find equally important. Where I differ slightly is, and this is I think an advantage because as you probably can tell despite my accent-free English, is that my background is in German, and believe it or not, the German people do think differently than the rest of the world. Sometimes fortunately, also of course very often unfortunately. But we have this thing in our language where we have a broader distinction between what we usually call culture and civilization. Right? I was talking with some of you outside before this session, and for example, many of you I'm sure have read Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. Right? We wouldn't use that term in German. Right? We would call it the clash of cultures. Because in German, at least we did in the past, we distinguish between the idea there's civilization, which is technology, right? Which is progress in the area of industry, in the area how we do things, how we use energy, right? Kind of the material world and the material forces. And then there's culture, which is the metaphysical, the search for meaning, if you want, right? It's this idea, kind of the spiritedness, if you want, of an individual and the people. And this goes back to what Nina was saying. And these two things are, of course, intertwined, right? If I kind of treat them now as if they're two separate things, I just do it out of convenience. But of course, in reality, they are tightly connected. Because the stage of civilization you live in depends on the kind of culture that came beforehand. Right? So this is one of the things, and I hope this is something also kind of want you to think about after these 3 days. Right? Modern society, industrialized society, is of course in many ways a direct consequence of the way how Christianity looked at the world. Right? If you look at people like Isaac Newton and other, giants of the Enlightenment, you'll figure out that they were very, very interested in questions of theology. And for Newton, the idea was that God reveals himself or herself, or whatever now the correct term here would be, or the divine reveals itself in two ways. One is revelation, right? What you read in the Bible. But the argument, the second I made was, it reveals itself via nature, right? That God created laws, right? That nature is not just working randomly, that, the sun might go up, maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe water flows downwards and then it flows upwards. No, there are certain rules, right? There is one entity that can change those rules, which would be the divine. But the divine does so only in very, very, very exceptional cases. I mean, just as a general question, what do we usually call it if such a case happens? What are these things called?
Focus.
What?
Focus.
Well, I put a pin in that. Miracle. It's a miracle, right? So even this is the whole point, right? Hypothetically, nothing is impossible for God. But even God only breaks the rules he made on rare occasions. This is why we call it miracles. So what people like Isaac Newton were thinking was, well, if there are certain laws created, we can understand these laws. And the better we understand these laws, the better we can understand God. And this was in many ways the birth of modern science. Now, to be very clear, right, these paths have now diverged significantly. But this is what I meant when I said about civilization and culture. Now, you can nowadays be a scientist and be an atheist. I don't think that's a problem, as Richard Dawkins would tell all of you. But to reach that level, that civilizational level, right, where you can do the kind of research that Richard Dawkins has been doing, you need the cultural underpinning. And in many ways, this cultural underpinning was a Christian underpinning. And again, right, the point here is not to be very clear. The point here is not to say that now, does this mean that Christianity is superior to other belief systems? No, not at all. It has different consequences. And this is kind of the point that I'm trying to get to. Because there's another thing that I do not believe. Maybe I'm wrong there, but that I do not believe. Which is that, and this is something that became particularly interesting and popular with Karl Marx, right? This idea that, sure, we are all individuals and we live our lives, but ultimately there are structural forces. That you might believe you're in command of your own fate or you're in command of your own decisions and your life, but actually it's the structure of society, it's the structure of the economy, it's the structure of the family that forces you into a particular way of behavior. And even though you might think it is your choice, it really isn't. I mean, it's not entirely wrong, right? I think this is what we talk about, how we are socialized in a culture, how we are socialized in a society. It's not entirely wrong. There are many things that we believe are objectively true that would have been completely absurd to others who came before us. And I give you one example, the idea of progress. If you would have gone back to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, and you would have talked to them about the idea of progress, they would have had no idea what you're talking about. Right? For them, the idea was continuity, stability, or in the case of the Greeks very often, right, that life is cyclical, civilized, that everything is cyclical. It's a beginning, it's a high point, it's an end, and then it starts over and over again. The idea that there is something like a purpose to history, there's something that Kant talks about, that Marx talks about, that Hegel talks about, right, that we're developing towards an end point. This is also the argument, of course, of modern, if we want to use the term of modern progressives, right? That we are moving further along a path, and then at some point towards the end of this path, there's going to be one great utopia that awaits us. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, right? This is not something I can tell you. But this is a completely new way of thinking. This is not something you find in many civilizations or in many cultural ideas outside of the West. Once again, I feel obliged to say this. This is not a value judgment. It's just something how it has historically developed. Right? I know in the previous session, a topic was human rights, a very, very similar topic. Right? The idea that the individual should be the focus of what we consider to be moral, right? The protection of individual rights. Again, something that Nina, I think, so eloquently pointed out, right? With we would also call probably hyper-individualism. And again, that might be a good thing. I'm not opposed to it. But it is something that would have been completely alien, for example, to somebody living in ancient Rome, right? If you would have said, well, the most important thing is the individual, they would have not understood what you're talking about, right? The same with ancient Greeks, the same with Hinduism, with Buddhism, right? For these civilizations, the idea that the individual is kind of the primary focus would have been completely absurd. Now, you might wonder, so where did this idea then come from? And this is where we have the intertwining of civilization and culture. Because we live in this fascinating age where hypothetically, I've never done it, maybe I tried for a year once, but I don't recommend it. Hypothetically, I could lock myself up in my room, work remote, get a cheeseburger and a pizza delivered every day, and never leave my room. So I could truly survive and live and be in contact with other people, even though I'm not really part of a group, right? I'm not really part of a larger society, a larger collective. Now, this is a luxury I could hypothetically afford because of the civilizational / technological process and progress that we've made. This was not an option in the past. If you lived, 3,000 years ago and you said, you know what, guys, I'm going to go it all on my own, you did, maybe for a week, maybe for 3 days, and then you were dead. So the option did not exist. Nowadays, we have these options. And this is what I mean. So this is the distinction when we talk about, so we can have civilizational progress, and then we can have cultural progress. But the question is, civilizational progress is easy to define, as I said, right? It's, I don't know, I got my first music on a record, right? This huge, vinyl, maybe some of you guys still know it kind of for collectors' reasons, and now I have it all on my phone. So I think there's a clear trajectory how technological progress made things more convenient, easier available, so fantastic things. Now, in the realm of culture, it's of course slightly different, as I said before, right? Because there we deal with questions of meaning. There we deal with questions of what makes life worth living. And many of the things, again, I agree very much with Nina said, that happened at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Like, I'm the one with the German accent, but it's actually Nina who sounded like the German philosopher, right? This very idea that modernization, that technological progress, it will rob us of who we truly are, right? It will no longer allow us to be, again, a term that is so important these days, it will no longer allow us to be authentic, to be our authentic selves, that technology has robbed us of our true identities. And this debate, by the way, has been going on since the early 19th century. So it's still, to be clear, it's still an important debate, but it's not really a new one. So when we look at some of the contemporary debates, right, whether it's ethnic identities, religious identities, sexual identities, these are just, let's say, different new colors or new shades of a debate that has been going on for a long time. Because once it became clear as a consequence of the technological progress that you could hypothetically, and now in our age you could do it literally, that you could live without tight connections to whatever group you are part of course this then throws the question back of you, who are you really? Because again, if I go back to the Romans and the Greeks, you couldn't ask that question because you were part of a family, you were part of a community, and there was no choice because you needed them to survive and they needed you to survive. So your identity was pretty much set. Now in a world where you can be an individual, of course that identity is much, much more fluid. That's awesome. If you're super successful, if you happen to have some skills, some talents that nobody else has, right, then individualism is an absolute asset. But of course, it can also be very, very stressful, because the other message that came out of this technological revolution was, listen, in a world where 99% of the people are planting potatoes in the fields, it doesn't matter if you're a talented musician, a great influencer, or as a very skilled mathematician. You're literally all the same. Society was very equal at that time. But by the point with technological progress, where in agriculture, in other areas, a lot of things started to be done by machinery, and people were free to do something else, all of a sudden the question was, okay, if you no longer work in the fields, if you no longer do agriculture, what else can you do? Now this creates an anxiety, because, what is your name? Ryan? Yeah, because as long as Ryan and I were planting our potatoes, our crops, we were completely equal. But what if it turns out that he's actually a math genius and I'm dumb as a rock? In an actual industrialized society, we'll find out very quickly. So he might be happy, but maybe he's unhappy with this too, because maybe we liked each other. Maybe he thought, Ralph and I were basically the same. And then he realizes, oh no, we're not at all. And he's going to move into a swanky, loft somewhere in downtown London, and well, I don't know where I'm going to end. But this is it then creates the kind of problems with inequality that we're also discussing about. And this brings me to, how am I doing time-wise?
You've got 3 minutes.
Perfect. Because this is I had a little more, but I think I can do it in 3 minutes. And this gives us now the key question that I hope we can then also discuss with you is, civilizationally, as I said, the idea of progress is pretty clear-cut, right? We want better medicine, we want more efficient apartments, more efficient transportation. That's also one side. With culture, it's different, because then we have to ask the question, progress, all right, but progress to where? And that's the thing, that's a decision. I give you one example. Imagine, not too much, but imagine for a second you win 12 million pounds in the lottery. Ryan and I will both win 12 million pounds. Now it depends. I might say I'm going to be very frugal, right? I'm going to use maybe, I don't know, 10,000 pounds every month, because this will then last me towards the end of my life and I'll be fine. Ryan maybe says, to hell with it. I'm going to spend my 12 million pounds in the month of January and I'm going to have the biggest party of my life. For the entire, I know you wouldn't. For the entire month of January, right, we probably would say, God, look at Ryan. He's living the life, and Ralph is just living his average life. But Ryan might know this, right? The question then is, it's a choice what we then would perceive as progress. Is progress, and this goes back to also what Nina mentioned, that you say you live a life where you indulge in whatever you can, where you do whatever makes you feel good, whatever satisfies you. It doesn't matter what it is. You want to open up your OnlyFans account, no problem. Right? All these things where there are no more restrictions anymore, because whatever you want to do, it all depends how it makes you feel. And that's right. This is a form of progress. Or you could argue, which is, as I said, that I'm metaphorically undressing for you. This is what I'm doing now. Right? I'm an old school nationalist. So for me, it's very, very important to maintain and to sustain the nation. So therefore, I care about birth rates, right? I care about morality. I care about social cohesion. But of course, somebody could justifiably say, you know what, Ralph, that's your idea of progress, because these are the goals that you care for. If somebody says, to go back to Ryan, right, I'm in my early 20s, I just won £1 million in the lottery, and now I want to live my life to the fullest, and then, go to an early grave with a gin tonic in one hand and a cigarette in the other. The question is, who am I to tell him? And I think this is why we have to get away from the idea, what we often do, to see that progress is a clearly defined set. I think we have to enter the debate both politically and societally. Okay, what is where do we want to progress to? Right? Do we say we want to be the individual that spends the 1 million in the first month? Or do we say we want it to be something sustainable because we, for example, care about the idea that there is something like Britain in 100 years? But that's a choice, right? And I think this is the question then that we have to ask. Thank you very much.